Hello, my name is Tom DuPont. I'm with Codesmith Tools, and today I'm going to be doing part 2 in our 2-part series over Plinko, Codesmith's enhanced alternative to LINQ to SQL. While part 1 was going over what Plinko is and showing how to use the Quick Start, part 2 is going to be a more advanced video geared towards developers, and we're going to go over how to manually create a Plinko project and how to implement and use some of its more advanced features. And as a developer, I can say, in my opinion, this is the more fun of the two videos. So, let's jump right in. Now, this video is going to expect that you've watched the first video, so I'm just going to jump right in here and get the ball rolling. So, if you're unfamiliar with any of the terminology that I'm using, or any of the features I'm referring to, please watch the first Plinko video in order to get caught up. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new console application here. I'm going to call it Plinko Demo. I do a console application because I'm going to want to be able to execute it and run it a little later. And the first thing we have to do to make this into a Plinko project is right-click on the project, do Add New Item, and we're going to have to add a Codesmith project. And I'm going to be doing the Pet Shop database, so I'm going to call mine Pet Shop. So as I set up this project, I'm going to go over each CST one at a time and explain all the options and show a lot of the features of each as we go along. And at the very end, we're going to put them all together and use them. So I'm going to right-click here and do Manage Outputs. And the first thing we're going to add is going to be our DBML CST. Now I have copied these templates to a local location, and I'm going to choose C# DBML. So let's go over each of the properties in this CST. The first is the clean expression, and that is going to be a regular expression that is used to clean out any table view or column names. So basically a generic way to remove any unwanted characters or words that are common to any of your objects. The next is ignore list, and that is a regular expression of what tables or views to ignore. So you could set that up to just say, cart, and it would ignore the cart table, or you could make it a regular expression to ignore anything with the suffix of admin or anything of the sort. The next the next property is include functions, and that's going to be whether or not to include store procedures as methods in generation. And then the one after that is include views, and that is, of course, whether or not to include views in with your tables and business objects. Which brings us to source database, and that's the first one we're actually going to go ahead and fill out here. And you have to select source database to generate from, and you can choose any data source that you have configured in Codesmith. I'm going to go ahead and choose Pet Shop. Notice that it's filled in some other options for us, but let's keep going over those one at a time. Context namespace is your data context. What namespace is it going to be under? And we're going to do petshop.data. Entity base is the name of the object that's going to get generated that all of your linked SQL entities are going to inherit from. So we're just going to use the default of linked entity base. Entity namespace is the namespace that all your business entities are going to be a part of, and again, we'll just use Pet Shop data. Include delete on null is a more advanced option. That's for LINQ to SQL. It tells your LINQ SQL data context what to do with objects that have null associations. If you originally had an association that was an object and had a value, and you make it null, that'll tell it whether or not to delete that, as opposed to just remove the foreign key. So again, advanced LINQ to SQL option has to do with associations. Right after that, we have naming conventions, and this is actually expandable. Naming associations are to help control how all of your entities get named in the DBML. The DBML here is going to be key to the rest of Plinko because everything is going to generate off of it. So you want the most control in the DBML so that when it generates what you want, and thus everything else will inherit from that and generate from its results accordingly. Again, it's just the most important part. You want to make sure it generates correctly. So the first option is association naming. How do you want to name your associations? Do you want them to be, we have 3 options here, I believe. Do you want them to have no name at the end of them? Do you want them to be plural? So if you had multiple products, instead of just being product, it would be products. Or do you want a list suffix? So it would be product list. We'll go with the list suffix. And then these next 2 options here are how you want to name your classes and your business entities. So do we want them to be named as being singular, plural, or preserve whatever is going on in the database? And that means if you have a table called products, do you want it to become product, a single entity? Do you want to leave it plural, or do you want it to be preserved from the database? And then right beneath it is the same basic thing, only it's asking you, how did you do your naming conventions in your database? Are your tables named products, plural, or just product, singular? Or is it mixed? You don't actually know what all the tables are going to be consistently. And having those 2 is going to help Plinko use logic to make sure your business entities get named as nicely and cleanly as possible, so we don't accidentally hack off extra S's or add them, etc., etc. And the final option is the DBML file, and that is the actual name of the file that you're going to output the DBML to, which is going to be a standard DBML schema, so we're just going to name it petshop.dbml. And that configures that. So let's go ahead and generate it and see what we get. So it has added references to our project, and it has created a DBML. And notice that this DBML has no code behind it file. There's no file back here with a CS suffix. That is because Visual Studio usually generates all of the data context and entities to a file that is behind the DBML. Well, in our case, in Plinko, we've taken all that logic and all that code and separated it into multiple templates that will generate multiple files. So that's why that's not here. But it's still a standard DBML file, so we can open it up in Visual Studio, and we can look at it and even edit it right here in the default editor. And something I should point out here is that we've actually enhanced the Pet Shop database a little bit for this demo. We've added a few more columns to product here, and that is because the Pet Shop database is a pretty bland database, but that's the point. It's supposed to be very simple and very small. And we want to showcase a few more Plinko features that we wouldn't get to see with just the normal columns in the Pet Shop database. So product, create, date, password, and full description are added here solely for the purpose of this particular Plinko example. So now what I'd like to show you is how our DBML handles regeneration. As opposed to LINQ to SQL, you would have to delete objects and redrag them to get them to regenerate. So the first thing I'm going to do is rename one property, and I'm going to rename name to rename. And we're going to show how that gets persisted through generation. So we'll regenerate, and that will still have that change there. And then I'm going to come here into SQL Server Management Studio, and I'm going to add a new column to the product table. Let's call it newbie. Let's make it a bit, and we'll leave it as nullable. So now we have a new column in the database, and we have renamed one of our properties. And if we regenerate, it's going to ask us to reload. But when we come back and look at product, the new column is there, and the property name change has been persisted. So another advantage of Plinko is that it can handle regeneration updates and persist changes, unlike the standard LINQ to SQL editor, or sorry, LINQ to SQL DBML. So now that we've looked at the DBML, let's move on to adding our entities. So I'm going to manage outputs again, add a new template, and I'm going to go to our entities CST, add that. So not quite as many options in this particular template. This is a little easier to configure. First of all, we have to select a DBML file for it to generate from, and we created petshop.dbml, so we're going to tell it to use that. Next, we have an option for what .NET framework you are using, and we have 3.5 and 3.5 SP1, and that's going to control a couple of attributes that will get generated in the back end. I think specifically those control some serialization things. And then we have two booleans here, include data contracts and include data services. And again, this is going to control more attributes that will be added to the entities. I'm going to leave them both as true so we can show off what that's going to add. And then we have the last option here, output directory. And this is to help format our output and structure it and control it. So I want all of our entities to go in a folder called entities. And we now have that configured. So let's generate our entities. And notice that it has added more references to our project for us, created the entities folder, and dropped all the entities into it. So let's open up product, and we see it has its code behind file, and I want to look at that first. So first thing I want to point out is that I feel this is a lot easier to read than what Visual Studio generates. Aside from having a file structure here and having separate files for each business entity, I just feel the code in general is easy to read. There's regions that can collapse. And look at all these attributes that we have added here with Plinko. We have your standard LINQ attributes for specifying the table. We do data contracts for dynamic data. We have table scaffolding for dynamic data. We have a metadata type specified. We're going to look at that in a moment. And we have data service keys for ADO.NET data services. And that's just what's right here at the top on top of the actual class. We also have serialization methods. And when we look at the columns, they themselves have more things, such as component model rules set for string length, which dynamic data will use, and later on we'll look at how the manager object is going to use. Also, they're all ordered for serialization with data members. So if we look here at rename, we'll notice that we made that change earlier, and the private variable is still the name of the column, but the actual property has been turned into rename, which is what we told it to do, and it has persisted that and generated that way. So now let's go ahead and look at the front end of the file. And here I want to talk a little bit about our metadata. So first of all, I just want to define what we have here. We have a metadata object for each class, and it's in the front customizable file. And it has a property that matches each property inside the class itself. They all have the correct type value, and right from generation, we already have several attributes that are generated and associated with these. So for all columns that can't be nullable, we have required, and the Plinko data managers will be using this, as well as things like dynamic data. For certain special types, we even specify the data type attribute, and so in this case, we know this is a password, and full description is very large, so it's a multi-line text box. And for some date timestamps, we have logic to generate things such as entity state. So in this case, this is a create date. It's only supposed to get created and set once, and that is on the creation of the object, and this attribute knows that. Now, in the back generated file, we saw string length as being one of the attributes on those properties, but it's important to note that the metadata objects actually override what is in the background. So they'll append as well, but they will override what's back there. So if I want to change string length, so I want to come in here and set string length on rename as being, well, the database has to support it, but let's make it really small and say 10. That's going to override what was in the back in the .generated file. So now I want to show another feature that comes with this metadata, and that is that when it regenerates, notice this comment here, only attributes in this class will be preserved. We have a brand new merge strategy that we're using here, and that's going to help synchronize these properties with the generated file, preserve any changes you make to the attributes. So we just added string length to rename. Let's go ahead and delete required off of product ID. And then let's go ahead and delete these two properties right here. So now I've removed attributes from one, I've added attributes to another, and I've deleted two entirely. So if we save this and we regenerate, the changes we made are going to persist, but the columns we deleted are going to get inserted. It's asking us to reload. And sure enough, description and image are back, but rename and product ID, the changes we made were preserved. So this is really cool. Whenever you add columns, or delete columns to your database, the metadata is going to get updated, it's going to match, but any changes you make to attributes are going to get preserved. And I think that's a pretty nifty feature. So now next on the agenda is to look at the manager objects. So now I'm actually going to go ahead and add the managers and the query objects at the same time here, because they're very similar. But let's start with the manager objects. So we're going to select the manager CST. And this is actually probably one of the more complicated CSTs to configure with Plinko. We're going to select the source database because it needs to scan all the indexes and keys for generating its get methods. We have to select the framework again, and I'm going to choose 35SP1 again. And again, we have to specify our DBML, so petshop.dbml. And then here we actually have to pick the data context file that we are using, because it's going to have to extend that and add the managers. So Plinko demo, entities, and petshop data context. Next, we need a name for the data manager object. I'm just going to call it manager. And we have to specify the namespace. So to keep with convention here, I'm going to do petshop.manager, or managers. Okay, so that wasn't so complicated after all. Now let's go ahead and add the query objects. And just to clarify, the managers create separate manager objects to hold all of the standard GET queries. The managers also provide a rule set that gets added to the data context. The queries just add the GET methods, but instead of adding them in their own manager objects, they just create extension methods for the generic table objects. So some people don't want to add extra classes such as managers, and so they just go with queries to append right onto the table. Other people don't like their generic table objects getting very cluttered, and they don't want them to have a lot of methods when scrolling through it, so they'll do managers. And also, again, the managers add the rule system, which I think is pretty cool. But while it's possible to add both managers and queries, there's definitely some duplicated functionality there, so most people opt to just add one. But for this demo, we're going to do both. And so we have our source database, our DBML file again, and another output directory to control the output. So once again, let's generate. So the managers have updated our data context, which is why it's open here. And the managers have now appeared in their own folder, and the queries have appeared in their own folder. So this is the same file structure we've seen with the entities, with a front file and a generated code behind file. So I want to open up the product manager and the product query extensions side by side here. I'm going to collapse definitions and collapse definitions. And if we look at the methods that these have generated, we'll notice that they are the same get methods. You have a get by rename, a get by category ID, and I should point out that this is a get by primary key method, this is a get by foreign key method, and these others are actually get by indexes. And you can see they match. So for the most part, the managers and the queries are very similar. They're just implemented in different ways. So now that we looked at the code behind on those, I want to look at the front part of the manager here. And I actually want to paste in some custom code because these manager objects are a great place to start with your business logic. So the first thing I'm going to add is another additional get method, and this is get random product, which is just going to get the count of the products, pick a random number between 0 and that, and then get that specific product back from the database. The second thing that I've added here is, and I've added it into the extensibility method definitions region, is I've added an implementation of the partial method add rules. Let's resolve that. And I've added a method for isAwesome. So what I've done here is I've created a custom rule for the manager rules engine to use, and we're going to see this in a moment. But now it's going to call code that I have written to validate a product. So we see here we're doing a rules manager add, or add shared, and we're doing it for the product object. And we're adding a new custom rule, and you have to pass in the type of the property you want to check. So in this case, we're going to check full description, and that's a string. And this is the error message we're going to get if this does not pass. And this method isAwesome is right down here. And it's going to check to see if the full description has text, and if it does, it wants to see whether or not the word awesome is in the full description. So if it doesn't contain the word awesome, it's going to be invalid. So a bit of a juvenile validation, but it will show that we can programmatically add rules. And this is, again, on top of the rules that are coming out of such things as the component model, such as required or string length. This is now a custom rule that we're going to check. And again, I think this will all make more sense when we actually see it run. So now that we have everything generated, let's actually do that. Let's add some test methods and execute them. So this is another great missed opportunity to do unit tests. But I'm just going to paste these into my main here and run it with the console app. So I've pasted in 4 methods. The first one is entities demo. And if we resolve our namespace here, this will demo using the entities we've generated. And as we note here in the summary, this is just like LINQ to SQL. Really, this should be the exact same syntax as if we generated from LINQ to SQL. Only now it's the entities we generated with separate files as opposed to the standard ones. So to demo that, we're just getting a list, getting in an object, and creating a new one. So nothing fancy. And then we have a managers demo and a queries demo. And you'll notice that these are very similar. They're both going to do a get by primary key, and they're both going to do a get by category ID. The only difference here being that these are associated with the manager object, and these are just straight off the product table. Then the managers demo is also going to show how to use that custom method we made, get random product. So it's going to get 2 random ones to show they're different and they were random. And then the last method here is the broken rules demo. And this is going to try to create a business object, or I should say a product for the database. And when we go to save it, it should blow up. It should show us a nice, easy to read error message listing off all the rules that were broken. So let's just set some breakpoints here. And up before we run this, we're going to have to add an app config. And we just need this for our connection string. So I'm just going to paste in a whole app config here. Save that. And let's run it. And we've got build errors. Oh, I did not end region. Okay, so now let's run it. And so in our entities demo, we got categories, and we should have count 5, and indeed we do. If we look at the first one list here, we did indeed get a category. It was birds. And then we went and got a penguin. Look at the results. Sure enough, it is a penguin with all the proper data. And then we created a new object of Muppet, and if we look at Muppet here, that did get properly inserted into the database. All the data is there. So hit play again, and we're going to drop down into our managers demo. So we're doing get by ID, and we got back penguin. And then we're getting by category ID. So we got back 5 objects that should all be birds. And indeed they are. We started with pelican. And then we just got 2 random objects here. So we got a frog, and we got a duck. So now if we jump down into our queries demo, once again, we got Penguin, and we should have another 5 results. Yep, and the first one should be Pelican, and indeed it is. So now we come down to our final method, and that is the rules demo method. And so this is going to fail because we are not giving it a category ID, and the full description is invalid because it doesn't contain the word awesome. So if we press play, notice this nice custom exception here the rules engine is giving us. And actually it says that 3 rules have been broken because we didn't specify the category ID, and that also means that the category association object itself was null. And look, description is not awesome enough. So our custom rule ran, it gave us back a nice, easy to read list of all of them. And again, this came from the required attribute, which is coming out of component model, and it's coming from custom code that we wrote. So let's stop debugging. And so I believe that concludes this video. We looked at the DBML CST and how to configure that. We saw how if we make changes to the database, refreshing the DBML will get those changes. And also if we make changes in the DBML, it'll persist them through regeneration. We looked at entities and how to configure those and some of the attributes that it adds to the back end. We looked at the metadata class on the front end of our entities attributes and how we can customize those. And when we regenerate, it will be updated to match the back end, but still persist any attribute changes. We looked at managers and queries, saw how they were similar, and we looked at managers and saw how we can make custom rules with them, and we executed those, and we looked at the exceptions they passed back. So yeah, I hope you found this video to be helpful and informative. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future videos, please visit us at community.codesmithtools.com. My name is Tom DuPont, and thank you very much for using CodeSmith.